From your perspective, given that vantage point, what are some of the shortcomings that suggest you would like to find ways to integrate some of the innovations that these other two gentlemen are working so much on?
Great. Thanks very much, and thanks for being part of this very interesting panel. I have to admit, when I was asked to be part of this panel, I thought, first of all, geez, that's not really what I focus on now in my job. It was much more what I used to do when I was running economic policy at the Pew Charitable Trust. But the more I thought about it, I am in fact very, very much implicated in discussions of GDP, because at OPIC, not OPEC, but OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, we're the U.S. government's development finance institution, and we make multi-billion-dollar decisions every year on the basis of GDP per capita calculations for countries around the world, just as the World Bank does, just as the IFC does, and just as many other development finance institutions do around the world. So the measure of GDP has significant bearing on decisions that I make and that our government agency makes and that U.S. taxpayers by definition make within the international development context. So I then said, sure, this is a good panel to be on. We've heard many times during the course of this conference that oil, the petroleum industry, may be perhaps the single biggest industrial political power in Washington. The lobbyists, the infrastructure that surrounds that industry. If that is the case, I would stipulate that GDP, the measure, is by far and away the single biggest economic political power, in that it is the measure that drives decision-making in a way that no other economic measure does. If you folks think about television reporting, if you think about articles you read, the word growth often comes up. And what is growth but gross domestic product? And many, many decisions are made from the big to the small on the basis of that measure, which I think this panel will describe as being necessary, and that's important to say, but very, very insufficient. Think about interest rate decisions that central banks make based upon growth predictions or actual results. Those drive interest rates. That in turn drives personal, household, commercial spending and investment decisions, all on the basis of GDP, really. In my world, in the development finance world, we have countries that are eligible for certain types of financing and those that are not eligible for certain types of financing, all on the basis of GDP, or GDP per capita, which is increasingly misleading and for reasons that I think we'll discuss. And if I could just say briefly, the three things that I find most distorting, and I'm sure many of you have thought about these before, or most insufficient about the measure, are first that externalities are not internalized. So destruction to natural resources, habitats, etc., are seen as production as opposed to costs. That's a big one, particularly given the nature of this conversation. The second one is that GDP does not take into account inequality, and in many parts of the world, rising inequality. So you can have a very, very great top-line number divided by a number of people and have that number rising, but it says nothing about the underlying income distribution within societies. And that's particularly a problem in the developing world, but also a problem in our own country. And thirdly, and it's something that I'd love to have some conversation about within this panel, is this issue that as labor markets and capital markets globalize, I think there is an increasing tendency for GDP in one country, for there to be more of a zero-sum game than with closed economies. In other words, if you can actually pull labor, if you can pull capital from other countries and from other regions of the world, you are more likely to see growth in one area at the expense of another. And that is the case when economies are increasingly intertwined. So those are just three reasons of a litany why I think GDP is necessary but not sufficient.
Terrific. Thank you, John. Charles, can we turn to you for perhaps two interventions? One, to start this conversation with Stephen as well, as the two of you having really worked on some of these alternative ways and kind of taken as a point of departure that GDP is insufficient, but then spent your time in innovation finding alternative means to measure progress. But also kind of akin to Jennifer's presentation, perhaps say a word about the demand signals that you're getting in the UK and the very high level of political attention and interest and even kind of roles that you're playing in advising the government on these kinds of discussions.
Yeah, let me kick off with the last question. As you said, this is no longer simply an analytical discussion or a theoretical or academic discussion. It's actually become quite a live, certainly in the UK, quite a live political discussion. And the Prime Minister, David Cameron, has said that GDP is merely a means to an end, and we should be measuring our progress reaching the end, not simply one of the means that we use to get to the end. And he said this on numerous occasions, and he's asked the Office for National Statistics and various government departments in Whitehall to work on, first of all, establishing this measure, and then on incorporating it, finding ways of using these measures within policy making. And he said that he thinks that this process could be the most, as he put it, quietly radical thing that his government's doing. I mean, it's doing quite a lot of noisily radical things, like slashing the budgets and so on, but this is sort of a quietly radical thing, underpinning, some changes that we'll see in the longer term. And I'm often asked why. Why is he doing this? I mean, and someone was saying, it's a sort of Nixon goes to China situation. Someone I was talking to here, and in a way that may be the case. It's politically a way in which a conservative government is saying we're not just about cutting things. We are also about good things as well, and that's provided some of the political impetus. And we, of course, at New Economics Foundation are very pleased about this. We've been lobbying for it for many years, and now we're working with the government to try and make it happen. And I think I'd just like to say a little bit about why I think it's so important, though, if that's okay. I mean, I think that, as John was saying, there are clear defects to GDP, but I mean, GDP was never intended to be a measure of overall societal progress. I mean, when it was developed by Kuznets, he said, this is not a measure of societal progress. It's a particular measure of economic transactions, which is quite useful. But what happens in policy making and in journalism, whatever, is you find a measure that you can use, and then you use it. But there's a sort of absence of something that actually measures overall societal progress. So that's why it's become so important. So I mean, in a way, nobody really, I don't think anybody, correct me if I'm wrong, raise your hand if I'm wrong, but I don't think anybody thinks that GDP is an end goal in itself. It's only a means to an end. And it doesn't capture many of the things that we value. There's another point, though, and I think this is particularly important at this conference. It's a point about sustainability. And I was making this point yesterday, but I'm going to make it again because I think it's rather important. Basically what we want, I mean, everybody wants, in terms of success, is we want to improve people's lives in the short term. That's what we want to deliver, because there are lots of problems. But we also want to create the conditions which will allow us to go on improving people's lives in the long term. We've got to do both, and that's essentially the dilemma, if you like, of sustainability, and that trade-off has to be managed. Now, if you decide that your measure of progress in the short term, of improving people's lives in the short term, is GDP, you've got a real problem in managing that trade-off. Because, as I was trying to say yesterday, you've got a graph like that, and basically you've got low GDP, low ecological footprint at the bottom left-hand corner, high GDP, high ecological footprint at the right-hand corner. And if you plot countries, that's the pattern you get. Now, I'm not saying you can't make your economic activity more ecologically efficient. You can, but basically you've got a really difficult political dilemma, because if the choice is between good lives now and good lives in the future, good lives now always win. So sustainability goes out the window, or at least it's marginalised. However, if your measure of improving good lives now is couched in terms of broader measure of well-being, of how people feel their lives are going, of whether people are happy, then the trade-off is much, much easier to manage. The graph goes like that, and basically the scatter diagram of different countries is much less clear-cut. And you can move from the bottom right-hand corner, which would be high ecological footprint and low well-being, to the top left-hand corner, which would be low ecological footprint and high well-being. And there is a country at the top, Costa Rica, which has both of those things. It has low ecological footprint and high well-being, and it's got one of the highest in the world. So that is a message of hope, and I think from a sustainability point of view, this is why it's very important, as well as just being a way of being more efficient about policy.
So we've heard about how this discussion, debate has played out in developed country in the UK. Stephen, you spent a lot of time looking at poverty and development and also seeing the shortcomings of the GDP measure. Can you talk about some of the innovation, some of those shortcomings in that development context, and some of the innovations that you are putting forward as additional and alternative ways for us to understand progress?
Well, I'll start by adding a point that hasn't come up yet, but I think is an important one, and that is a distinction between GDP and GNI, gross national income. So as with many things, I think there's a lot of benefits in thinking also for our own country or wealthy countries about problems of measurement of well-being through the lens of poverty and through the lens of development. So the distinction between GDP and gross national income is GDP is just the value of whatever is produced in a country, regardless of whoever finally receives that income. And that gap can sometimes be fairly wide, and that's true particularly for a number of developing countries. So the first thing one would want to do, I think, is to look at income people are receiving rather than just the value of what's getting produced. It's already been, of course, mentioned that in addition to an average amount of income, we have to think about inequality and poverty as well, and that clearly is something that comes out through the lens of poverty and development. But I think there's also a long tradition in development, a 30-year or so tradition anyway, of recognizing pretty straightforwardly that income misses a lot when it comes to well-being. And I always think about the great leader, the thought leader, if you want to put it that way, as the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, whose capability approach to thinking about human well-being, I think, has made a big impact on thinking about development and poverty, and probably could make a bigger impact in thinking about well-being in the rich countries as well. And so he likes to talk about what he calls beings and doings as a better way to describe people's well-being, and so than even income. So he talks about some very obvious things like being well-nourished, being healthy, being able to live a long life, being literate, and so on. And he also talks about some more subtle things like being able to take part in the life of the community, which is an essential thing for human well-being, right? And so although one might think that something like being employed is not that important because it's subsumed within income somehow, by being employed you get income, nonetheless there's some inclusion aspect of having recognized valuable contributions in society from the fact that you even have a job. And then another point, which has just come up, has to do with happiness. So being happy is an obvious part of human well-being. Only a part, of course, but still an important part. And here I would, amplify, maybe with a slightly different diagram from Charles, but a very well-known one about the relationship between different measures of subjective assessments of happiness, right, on the vertical axis, and income on the horizontal axis. And we know that happiness goes up a lot as income increases, very dramatically, until about $10,000 or $15,000 per person. And then largely, though not completely, levels off. And there's some debate about how much it levels off, whether it really goes flat. But nonetheless, that's the rough idea of the shape. And so that alone, I think, is indicative that it's a worthy goal to improve people's well-being and income and so on, because it improves happiness. But happiness, as was pointed out kind of indirectly, is not exactly related to income. You can for any given country's level of income, you can have a much higher recorded level of personal happiness in one country than in another. So then just very briefly, I think that Sen's ideas have been reflected in some of the things we've talked about in the conference so far. The Millennium Development Goals have come up a number of times in the discussions. 8 major goals associated with specific targets for 2015. And only one of them has to do with income, and it's about poverty. It's by cutting in half between 1990 and 2015 the fraction of people who live on less than $1 a day. The rest have to do with nutrition. Environment is the 7th goal category. Several regarding health and education. So I think that's reflected there. The way the international community has gone about measuring well-being in the poorest countries is already multidimensional. The Human Development Index that the UN Development Program has run since 1990, a big revamp last November's 2010, Human Development Report came out with what I think is a better index, but what it does is to give weight to income, yes, but equal weight to education and to health. And we can talk about how those things are measured. I'll just make one last point, because this could all be food for thought and discussion. And that is some new work that has been done based on some ideas of Alkire and Foster that were also applied for the first time in a very public way by last year's Human Development Report. It's an approach to poverty, which is multidimensional poverty, right? So not poverty just as what fraction of people are below $1.25, or not just poverty as how severely below $1.25 are they, but measuring poverty not just a little, we'll look at a little of this, and we'll look at a little of this and a little of this either, but a kind of systematic approach. And what I like about it is that it starts from the household level. So you're looking not at something that's already been averaged up to the social level, and then you take an average, and then you take another average of something else, and you mash them together in some way. But this is really quite elegant in that it starts from the households. It looks at over 100 countries with comparable data, DHS data, for those of you who are familiar with it, and looks at a variety of deprivations and ways of measuring deprivation in health, education, and also assets that reflect standard of living, not income directly. And then takes what's called the dual cutoff method, which was, again, the Alkire and Foster innovation developed by the UNDP for this Human Poverty Index. And so you have to be below certain cutoffs, right? Such as in, for example, how nutrition deprived you are could be one example. And you have to be below those cutoffs in a sufficient number of dimensions, right? Because otherwise you fall into a trap and you say that, someone who's ill is necessarily poor. Well, that's really not quite right. There are many people are quite ill, but whom you wouldn't want to say are poor. So taking those things together, one then builds up to a national measure, but based on what's going on in the household, how poor one is. And you can think about doing something similar for general well-being. But one last thing that I like about this is it allows for the way these things interact, right? Because if you have a number of deprivations in people in a country, but they really are different people that you're talking about, that's far less severe than if you have a number of households who are simultaneously deprived in several areas. And that's what makes poverty more severe, more horrible, if you want. And so that I think this is a new kind of approach which I admire quite a lot. And so that's a bit of a survey. Yeah.
John, can we turn to you in part and make the point that you want to make, but also perhaps address what you see as the barriers in a place like OPIC to adopting these innovations? What are the hurdles we have to get across to have this wider conversation?
Well, I think it ties nicely into the comment I was going to make. I mean, it's interesting, Charles. You were asking the question, how many people here would think of challenging people to think about raising their hands? How many people out there think GDP as a growth is a ends in itself? And if you were to get the U.S. Congress in one place and ask that same question individually, you might see a couple hands raised. And I think that is because growth is such a, and I saw that, working in the nonpartisan advocacy world of Pew and now in the U.S. government, growth is such a driving ideological issue within certain parts of frankly of both parties, but particularly on the Republican side, that I do think it would. You might see some hands raised if you had Congress here, and I think it suggests one reason why it might be difficult for a U.S. government agency like OPIC to formally adopt alternatives to GDP for threshold investment decisions that we make. It doesn't mean that we don't find our own ways to do that now. For example, 5 years ago, when we give the department I oversee gives a development score to every single investment we do, and we certainly give credit to investments in higher income countries that have high income distribution. Higher scores to those countries, all things equal, than high income countries with low income distributions. In other words, right, we are giving credit for projects that address income inequality or poverty in wealthier countries. Otherwise, we would steer away from countries which have populations that are quite needy. I can think of several projects that we've approved in recent years. So I think it's a challenge for us because the U.S. Is not a leader in this discussion, despite the fact that Joe Stiglitz, I think, has been one pushing the envelope. But these initiatives do come from the OECD, the UN, Britain, and the U.S. has not taken an official government leadership role, I think, in many of these discussions.
So, Charles, are those barriers, well, presumably they're not there in the UK, but if you can tell us a bit more about how you could envision success in your advice to the UK government, what would they be doing differently if they take on some of these measures?
Yeah, I think there are two aspects to that, actually. One is the processes that they'll have to adopt in order to start using these metrics effectively. And then once they do that, what difference is it going to make? I mean, it's great to have all these new metrics of progress, but if it doesn't actually make any difference to what anybody does, it's all a complete waste of time. So I'll answer that in two halves, if that's okay. I think in terms of the processes, that itself has two aspects. One is you've got to be able to relate these sort of big idea of well-being, people's happiness, people's sense of purpose in life, people's relationship, the things that make life important to people. You can measure that, and you can then say that is how we're doing on those various different measures. You can produce some kind of compound index, and then you can measure your progress against how you're doing. And then, though, more importantly, you've got to be able to establish statistical relationships between movements in that measure and actual movements in the sort of things that policy can influence. So, for example, if housing is something that's very important to people's subjective well-being, to how they feel about their life, to their life satisfaction, to whether they feel life's going well or not, then you've got to be able to establish that relationship, and then you can act on, and you can prioritise housing, and thereby increase people's well-being. So you've got to be able to establish statistical relationships between subjective well-being measures and measures of objective things, which are the normal outcomes of policy. And that will enable you to prioritise. You can say, to take my example again, housing is particularly important because there's a very strong relationship, causal relationship, between housing and well-being, or not, as the case may be. And you then, having got those relationships, you've then got to incorporate that into the minutiae, into the sort of processes of government decision-making. It's all very well, the Office for National Statistics establishing the fact that housing is more important than whatever, something that's not important for people's well-being. But how does that then actually affect what policymakers do? And, basically, it gets a bit nerdy at this point, but you can start tinkering with the way that cost-benefit analysis is done and replacing the models that people use with new models which rely upon this new source of data. And that's actually very interesting. That's very interesting to people like me. That's the sort of cutting edge, because there you actually sneaking in, and then I go back to what Cameron said, quietly revolutionary. You're sneaking in a different way of evaluating policy. All that's fine, but it won't make any difference unless the politicians are asking the officials to do that cost-benefit analysis, to actually evaluate what impacts different policies are having on well-being by using these set of relationships. And that will only happen if politicians feel that the public are going to hold them to account for movements in the index. And at the moment, the public hold the politicians for account through movements in GDP, movements in unemployment, maybe movements in inflation. But they don't hold them to account through movements in well-being or quality of life, because there isn't an index. Once they start to do that, once the public starts saying, we need... once the public starts seeing a movement and saying, the politicians are to blame for that, I'm not going to vote for them, then of course the politicians will respond and they will ask the officials to do the analysis that's necessary. So you need both these things. You need the tools that the officials can use to give advice to the politicians, and you need the pressure from the public to motivate the politicians to ask the officials to do the work. And that is a little bit tricky. And the reason why it's tricky is because people, at the moment, they all care about well-being and happiness, of course. It's not that people don't care about it, but they tend to think that it's not something that politicians are responsible for, because your own personal happiness, and happiness is a very dangerous word here, your own personal happiness is not something you associate with politicians. You associate it mainly with your own personal life. So there is a danger that the whole thing becomes derailed by the fact that people don't understand that politicians are responsible for it. And I think that's a very important part of the communication that has to happen. Now, once you've got all that in place, it will make a difference. I mean, that's just the second part of my answer. It will make a difference because we know from research that's already been done that, as has just been said, GDP is an income is not a particularly good predictor of well-being above a certain, once you reach a certain level. We know that, for example, unemployment is an extremely good predictor of well-being or lack of it. Therefore, if there's a trade-off to be made, for example, between maximising GDP and minimising unemployment, you should minimise unemployment, even if that means you're not going to get as much, you're not going to maximise GDP. Now, often, of course, those two go together and there isn't a trade-off. Well, fine, no problem. But sometimes there is. And that's where these sort of things really could make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, I want to ask you one more question before we turn to the audience for the conversation. We're at the Aspen Environment Forum. You've done a lot of work on this in specifically the context of environment and climate change in developing countries. Can you say a word about how you've applied some of these broader notions of alternative indices to that specific set of climate change adaptation challenges in low-income countries?
Sure. Let me say something about environment then. Let me also, in just a moment, mention something about two other areas that have come up here, and one has to do with measurement and one in terms of implementation. Just first, briefly, in terms of measurement, we don't really know all that well or precisely how to measure something like happiness yet, right? So we go and we ask people questions like, are you happy? And you answer. And we ask, are you satisfied? And then they answer. And then you take an average of the two answers. And I think we need more work to make sure that this is really comparable across countries. So I think it's on the right track because I think well-being, as I said before, as Amartya Sen has told us, quite rightly, is a big part of human well-being. But there are other things that we're able to measure a little bit better. And housing was mentioned before. Do you have a floor? And if you do, is it dirt or wood or cement or so these are some of the things that are looked at in the multidimensional poverty index that I mentioned. In the first round, I think I might have once called it the human poverty index. If I did, I meant the multidimensional poverty index. So I wanted to clarify that. In terms of implementation, another thing I think is important is that you talked about the public pressure from the citizens, Charles. I couldn't agree more. Having measures that are kind of bottom up are important too, right? Because again, I think often the conversation does go to, well, we have an index for this and an index for that, and let's take an average. I'd rather see something where we can understand how different measures of well-being and deficits of well-being, deprivations, interact. And the final thing is that it's nice to have a measure that is flexible enough so you can go to a local community and say, okay, here's what's been done so far for the country, but here in this village, what do you think is the most important? And they might say, no, it's really not water, it's whether the teachers are in school or not, right? And so you should have an approach to measurement, which this MPI that I mentioned does have, that is very flexible, and you can go to a community and get them engaged with measuring their own well-being the way they would think about it. And I like that aspect of it. Just very briefly about environment, I think I mentioned in yesterday's morning plenary that a major problem with GDP is that when we finally look at income measures, we have subtracted off appropriately for depreciation of our capital goods, but we don't appropriately allow for depreciation of our environment, which is a critical part in a very broad way, thinking of capital. And your environment is a big part of your capital, as is your education and your health. So I think that is really quite critical. We are having a bit of a hard time measuring degrees and success of adaptation because, as we know, there already has been some climate change visible, including in East Africa, for example. But we know, unfortunately, most of it is yet to come. And so we've had different strategies, and one is to say, well, okay, the IPCC results tell us that one thing we can expect from global warming is a greater intensity of severe events. Kind of our conversation that we had the first evening in this forum. So there'll be more of these. So let's study how people respond to severe events. And it also is a way of coping with environmental change. We try to look at how people have responded to some longer-term drying or things of that kind, another imperfect measure. And finally, we have the measure of going and asking people, have you seen climate change? And if yes, what kind and what have you done about it, right? And people give very interesting and reasonable answers for these things. They say, well, the rains are coming later, we plant later. That's something that comes out in surveys. And there are a number of these things. But we still have a way to go about this because sometimes when people check, the perceptions of the farmers don't match with the local meteorological stations, right? And maybe the stations are sometimes a little bit too far away, but apparently it is also a common human impulse to think things are getting worse. And so we have to find some ways to take these things into account. But this is a desperately important problem because I've seen a lot of evidence that really leads me to conclude there are so many things we can do, are doing, and plausibly can be successful in eliminating extreme poverty. The biggest risk to that achievement is environmental degradation. And behind that, much of it, though not all, but a substantial amount, ultimately driven, of course, by global warming and climate change. So I'd bring it back on that way.
Okay. I think Charles's intervention, or Stephen's intervention, has prompted both Charles and John to have comments. And so why don't I urge you to integrate those into your terrific answers to questions that we garner from the floor in the broader discussion, because I want to make sure our colleagues here have a chance to jump in. We have microphones at the side, so if you have a question, if you could come up and identify yourself and pose it in a concise fashion, we'll get that into the discussion as well.
Thank you. Paul Anderson, Aspen Times. Paul Anderson, Aspen Times. A friend recently sent me an article in a magazine. It happened to be a 1957 issue of Look magazine, Life magazine, in which I was paging through, and I found an advertisement for a Hot Point dishwasher that featured a housewife in a skirt and apron doing a pirouette in the kitchen as her dishes are being washed by a machine. Equating progress with happiness, I think quite often ends up being a commercial venture and an advertising ploy. Who determines, ultimately, what happiness is and how it equates with industrial progress?
Okay, thank you. Because we have so many, why don't we take a couple so we make sure we get to everyone. Ma'am?
Hi, yep, I'm Annie Perkins, and I work for Anderson Corporation in Minnesota. And all of this is really cool stuff, but it's really high-level policy stuff. I'm wondering if on a smaller scale comparable to GDP, how can for-profit businesses incorporate well-being factors, for-profit businesses incorporate well-being factors and other intangible, non-financial benefits of sustainable business practices into traditional ROI and accounting balance scorecards.
Excellent. Thank you very much for introducing the for-profit sector as a consumer. We've talked a lot about governments as consumers. Why don't we take one more, sir?
Great. John Sturman, MIT Sloan School of Management. So I think this is a wonderful panel to have, and I really appreciate that it's in the program. And just picking up on the last comment, it is fairly high level. We need to revise the way the national income accounts are done so we can integrate these alternative measures. But what I would really like to hear from the panel is what the concrete implications are for policy and for education. So I teach this material on subjective well-being and its relationship to sustainability and so forth to our MBAs, and they find it a very uncomfortable conversation to have. because they are pursuing careers that are going to lead them down the path of working very hard and earning a lot of money. And they believe that's going to make for a happy life. And it doesn't. The research shows that it doesn't. And they're going to sacrifice a lot of things along the way. It turns out to be a wonderful conversation, but it's a very uncomfortable one initially. Back to the policy question. So we've heard a lot about the externalities, not just in this session, but throughout this forum, that need to be captured. So I'd like to hear what the specific policies are, specifically with this issue, that will help to do that. So, for example, limits on advertising, limits, as was alluded to in the previous question, limits on the ratio of incomes from the top to the bottom in a society, achieved perhaps through a much more progressive tax code. I'd like to hear some specifics about those policies. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we take those three? Charles, would you like to kick us off?
I'll take the first two together because I think they kind of sort of fit. The question about the washing machine and the question about what for-profit businesses can do. And I was reminded of an advertisement, I think, from Procter & Gamble, which was said that you can achieve true happiness with a particular kind of shampoo. That's clearly not the way forward. We have a concept of flourishing, is the word that we use. And flourishing is not simply about feeling happy or momentarily happy. I can feel momentarily happy by having a drink, or if I'm a drug addict, by having a shot. That's a fix. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about some kind of drugged world. Flourishing is actually a much more active. It describes something much more active. It describes having someone who flourishes has a good relationship with the world. They have good relationships with their friends and their family. They have a good relationship with the environment. They have a good relationships with their work. They do things. They feel their life is worthwhile, and they feel a sense of freedom. Those are the components of well-being, and those give rise to feelings of happiness, or rather sustainable feelings of happiness, rather than the momentary fix you might get from watching an advertisement. So that's a very important distinction, and I'm very grateful for the questions, actually, because it allows one to make that point. What can businesses do to encourage flourishing? That's a very, very interesting question. What do businesses do? Do they promote products which are essentially addictive? I mean, not quite like heroin, but nonetheless essentially addictive, because you get a fix from them and you want more of them. Or do they create products which allow people to flourish in the sense that I've just described? Well, clearly you can do either. There is an interesting case, and we're talking to Saatchi and Saatchi about whether that you can build a brand around helping people to flourish, whether there are things that you can do, help people have an active life, remove the barriers that we all face to doing things actively, having good relationships, etc., etc. How can businesses help people to remove those barriers? So I think there's an awful lot that businesses can do, but it's a conversation that we're just beginning to have. Turning to questions of policy, yes, okay, absolutely. If you take this seriously, there are a lot of. You will change your economic policy quite radically. We think that, given the point about income, you will not target GDP. You will target everyone being within a certain band of income. Whether it's sort of 50, you'd like to get as many people as possible. You can't get everybody. With an income, family income of between, say, $50,000 and $100,000 a year. You're not bothered about people who have more than that because it doesn't make them any better off in real terms. But you are bothered about people below that band, and you want to get them there. So that becomes the key target for economic policy. You want to minimise unemployment because we know that reduces people's well-being, and you make that an absolutely key target. You want stable communities because we know that people that stable communities are vital to people's well-being, and therefore you won't promote policies, economic policies that depend upon people moving around, finding jobs, driving around, or you won't promote policies, someone was talking today, that require people to be dislocated from where they live and just sort of living in an anonymous suburban world where they don't have any community at all. You want to restrict advertising, as was being suggested, so that you don't promote those kind of activities which don't actually sustain people and create enduring well-being. So yes, absolutely, there are lots quite radical implications for this. We're not always shouting that because it's a Conservative government in the UK that's introduced these things, and maybe we don't want to frighten them.
You have to be quiet while you're being radical. Okay,
I'll just be very quick because I think that was a very comprehensive answer. To Paul's point, and this was one of my questions I was going to try to ask you about, Stephen. When you mentioned that the alternative metrics that are emerging now, to some extent, are kind of tailored and can be location specific, that is a form of incorporating local priorities into a measure. On the other hand, it creates difficulty with cross-country comparisons. One of the things GDP does well, for all of its flaws, is it creates a metric, flawed as it is, for comparisons and trends over time that I think are useful. And so my question, I guess the question would be for you, is when you begin to tailor a metric that takes into account different priorities for different countries, does the cross-country comparison become diluted? And if so, what are the implications for a policymaking standpoint for that? So that's a question I'll push down to you. To the question of specific, what can private companies do? There is a burgeoning movement now around alternative accounting standards. These are not replacements for, but parallel alternatives to, and some of the next conversation from 5 to 6 tonight is on impact investing. I think we'll talk about what some of those are, but B Corp is the name of a corporation that's coming out and has designed what they believe is a more wholesome, fulsome accounting system for companies to basically self-rate themselves on and become B Corp rated. The Global Impact Investing Network has put out a whole series of measures that are alternatives to traditional GDP, which I think are also worth investigating. And then quickly, I'm a business school guy. I pursued the impoverished route as opposed to the private sector. So I'd love, but I don't think we should use the opportunity of moving off an alternative GDP to socially engineer more compressed income bands. I would very much support what Charles said, which is we're trying to get people above a level. We're not necessarily trying to compress bands. I think my view is that so economic policy it should be focused on raising the bottom as opposed to pulling down the top. I know that's a challenging and heavily charged debate, but I think that's the debate that will win the day in Washington from a centrist policy perspective.
Stephen?
Very interesting questions, and I'll try not to be repetitive of these good answers. And I, again, like to look at this from the lens of poverty alleviation and development, partly because I think it's clearer from that point of view, partly because I think that's really fundamental. But I think about poverty alleviation and development in low-income countries as resting on a three-legged stool, and government is one of those. The private sector is one of those, and civil society is the third, of which the constructive NGOs are the most organized component, if you want to put it that way. I think all have roles to play in improving well-being. I think that when one of the sectors is falling down, if you want, not living up to its potential, having failure, as we often like to say, there's opportunities for the other two sectors, if you want, to step in when for example, when the private sector is severely falling down, as it is in some rural areas in some of the countries I study. NGOs have stepped in and brought some goods to people that otherwise wouldn't be there. So I think that's a useful way to frame things. I do think that with regard to the question of inequality and to the question of whether people are better off after a certain threshold of income or not, Robert Frank and some others have pointed up, I think, something very important, which is that a lot of people's striving, apparently, for higher levels of conspicuous consumption and incomes has to do with a quest for relative status, right? Mm-hmm. So, but on the other hand, that is a zero-sum game. Other things have been talked about in the conference that, I'm not sure are zero-sum games, but this one certainly is, right? So in the end, no matter how hard you try, only 10% of the people will live in the neighborhoods with the 10% of best schools. And so everybody works hard to make more income so they can buy a more expensive house to be in the top 10% of schools. In Bob Frank's example of this, this is a very widespread concern, I think. And so that is yet one. If there weren't enough other reasons for government policy to try to reduce inequality, I think that's a very good one. And I think it might in itself make some of those higher income strivers for relative status better off, because maybe they're still relatively where they were. They're just having more hours to actually enjoy it. So I think there's a lot of constructive things that can be done in that regard as well.
Terrific. We have 5 folks standing up. Why don't we get those 5 and only those 5, and then give a very quick opportunity for folks to respond to them, and then we'll finish up on time. Sir.
Okay. So my apologies for taking the discussion back macro again, but I'm a business school guy as well. I think in every single case that I had, there's a fundamental underlying assumption that economic growth is necessary. You look at models and there's always an upward trend, regardless of how you try to measure well-being or happiness. Is growth necessary to improve well-being?
Okay. Amy?
Well, I know we only have a little bit of time, so I'm hoping we can get into this the next panel, because I'm on it with John, and talking more about the role of the corporates, and I'm going to talk about B Corp and these new metrics, because it's more about the overall operating environment for both that business has, and how these metrics that government is setting up, how does that then support businesses as they're developing their processes for setting up new metrics for social and environmental outcomes themselves. So I was curious about the business-government interface, but I know we only have a couple minutes, so maybe we can get in that more in the next one.
Good. No, thank you. Sir?
Thanks. Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's all right.
Very
Playing ping pong here.
Very provocative panel, a lot of questions. I was wondering whether any of the systems that you're thinking through take into account the life course. So people who are willing to make certain sacrifices to their own happiness early in life in order to achieve happiness later in life. And then there's the paternalistic aspect of it, which could come in. What should people be happy with later in life? Will we impress that on people? Charles, you mentioned that it may be a better value to have purpose in life rather than pure pleasure in life, and that purpose is a higher good on the happiness index. And people have the idea that older people strive for a sense of purpose, and are we going to push them into realms in which they're getting the kind of happiness we think they ought to have, but they may not be clamoring for themselves?
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, David Levy from University of Massachusetts, Boston. Yeah, on the zero growth element, the stock market crashed today to nearly 300 points just on some small rumors of slowing growth. We're addicted not to growth, but to rapid growth. If China even slows down, the whole the globe will go back into a double-dip recession and large unemployment. And so I'm thinking about the sort of the disconnect, perhaps, or is there one, between the generating these new kinds of measures and the structural linkages that we have between the drive for growth in order to sustain employment, and at the same time, the sustainability problems. The only substantial cut in emissions that we've had ever was during the Great Recession the last couple of years, and yet that's not the way we really need to be cutting emissions. Is this about the structure of the economy, or is it about the measures? And just as a little piece of that, as a Brit who's been in the States 25 years, do these measures address leisure time? Do they address the insecurity that we face in retirement? I mean, I found America to be a hugely insecure place. But that's just a piece on the measures, yeah.
Okay, and then the last question?
Steve Johnson, I'm finishing a book I call Integrity at Scale. And let me ask sort of the same question with a couple of different phrases. Sometimes I wonder, what the difference in the society would be if everybody woke up in the morning saying, what are my responsibilities, instead of everybody waking up in the morning, or saying what are our responsibilities, instead of everybody waking up in the morning saying, what are my rights? A more formal way to ask that is to ask if you have thought about the work that Robert Putnam did in his study of democracy in Italy, where he had both an outcome measure that has something to do with the effectiveness of different Italian provinces in addressing social issues, and an input measure which had to do with the richness and denseness of civic capital. And I think it would be interesting to know the outcomes that you've been discussing, but it might also be interesting to have a measure of of inputs that might be success factors or failure factors that affect those outcomes.
Terrific. Thank you very much for some excellent questions. We'll go the opposite direction so that, Stephen, you can kick us off.
Well, there's really a lot of things to talk about here, and we don't have enough time to do it. But I think the point about social capital is certainly a very good one. Needs a lot more emphasis than it sometimes gets. Putnam's work was certainly quite interesting, and we could have a long discussion about that. We need to measure it better than we have. Again, the question of advertising came up, and certainly a market economy is very good at not taking into account the externalities, getting people what they think they want. And a lot of times those are things people really need, and sometimes they're not. And I think that's what you're getting at, and that is a problem. And that's, I think, been widely raised for the last few decades, but people have not done much about it. We have a hard enough time getting any restrictions on people's, on companies' advertisement for children's shows on Saturday morning to kind of manipulate children, let alone what happens with subliminal and some other tricks that are used. Again, I like the civil society point. It's the third stool, if you want. I don't want to order them, but the third stool in the three-legged stool for poverty alleviation, for development. And I think it plays a good interactive role potentially with some of these points about business integrity with respect to the triple bottom line and environment and so on, right? So an example, I think Karl Pope yesterday said we need to get to a point where where it becomes unacceptable for anyone to have a mahogany dining room table, and when friends come over for a party, for it not to be asked, say, where does it come from? And it's not acceptable to be unable to answer the question, right? And so, but that costs something. Running these certification programs and so on does cost something. So if nobody is willing to pay more for the certified product, it won't happen because it costs something to set up the certifications. But if everybody demands it, because you might be asked that question at the dinner party or whatever it might be, right, then everybody may be willing to pay enough to pay for the effort at the certification. And this would therefore help ensure that the companies also are not losing money, and might also give them an incentive to get on, an early part of the bandwagon of making these things happen. So there's a lot of subtleties here, just very briefly on the measures and community-based measures. Of course, we've always had local, right, state, national levels to think about, and we all measure things differently. Transparency is very important here, so we can all see ourselves what all the different measures are for well-being on the health side, the happiness side, education, income, and so on, and so that we can make uniform assessments just by taking these numbers in a particular way that we want, compare things across countries, but still give the local community the freedom to think about its own measures at the same time. How do we think we're doing as a community? So that's where I'd leave it.
I just answered two of them. There were a lot of great ones, but the two that I'll reflect on is the first question: is growth necessary? I think that books have been written about that, and my quick answer is in a world of increasing population, growth is important, if not essential. And in demographically declining countries such as Japan and large parts of Eastern Europe, growth is still necessary in order to deal with income disparities within the country. And so I think, yes, growth is important. I think there are a few cases where it may not be. But in large part, yes, economic growth should be a national, I think, imperative. How you measure that is, I think, of the topic that we've been touching on here. The question of, David, your question about measures and metrics, I think that so clearly we're on a hair trigger when it comes to when it comes to growth. Markets fall 280 points quickly on rumors of or on reports of slowing growth. What I think we're going to see emerging within 2 or 3 years, right, is an alternative measure, which will be something that runs parallel to, in a small number of European countries, GDP. And I think as it is picked up, it will provide an important kind of advanced notice to the U.S. and many other countries about its utility. And we'll begin to see how it's adopted and how policymakers respond to it. I will only say that I think most people in this room probably know, if I say what's the happiest country in the world? Anyone know? I mean, Denmark, right?
Married to a Dane.
So measures of happiness are becoming increasingly commonplace and reported, and guess what? The U.S. is not so high up there, and that's provoking discussions within important corridors in Washington about what are we doing wrong? Discussions that weren't being had 10 years ago, but were being had 40 years ago. I encourage everyone to read Bobby Kennedy's speech at University of Kansas in 1968, 3 months before he was assassinated, when he talked about the limitations of GDP. Very inspiring words from a politician. You would never hear those words out of someone's mouth today running for national office. 1968, March 18th, I believe it was, University of Kansas. Great speech on the limits of GDP.
Charles, very quickly.
Let me answer this question very quickly. First of all, is growth per head necessary? It depends. In the developing world, clearly yes. In the developed world, yes for now, while we make the transition. I mean, the point was made about the disconnect and the difficulties of adjusting. We certainly need growth in order to make that adjustment and in order to reduce the income inequalities, which growth facilitates. But in the long run, growth will not be necessary, I'd suggest. And just going back to that point about the disconnect and the question about, I think the word leisure was raised, and I didn't make this point earlier. I should have done. One of the key things that one of the key alternatives to traditional economic growth will be increased leisure time. You know, if you get more efficient, you can either produce more or you can work less to produce the same amount. And there will, I suggest, be a shift towards, as people get richer, a shift towards a shorter working week. That hasn't happened, but that probably will happen, I suggest, in the future. And that will be the mechanism which will allow the economy to keep on running without massive unemployment and without huge disruption while growth rates slow. Point about paternalism. It's not sort of men in white coats who are sort of determining what people should want or not want. It's actually what people say themselves. And in the sort of research that's done, people want to have lives that are worthwhile, which is hardly a surprising finding. But nonetheless, just...
You confirmed it.
It's confirmed.
You confirmed it.
Yeah.
More research is clearly...
More lives that are worthwhile. So it's not that we're saying you've got to have a life that's worthwhile. As they say, we want a life that's worthwhile. And then you ask them, how worthwhile is your life? And they say, well, it's sort of all right. So I think the paternalism is often overplayed. And actually, GDP itself is a rather paternalistic measure because it's saying what matters is GDP. They don't think that anything else matters. Whereas with well-being, you ask people, them, what do you feel about your life, which is much less paternalistic. And then on the point about social capital, I completely agree. Input measures are absolutely vital. Social capital, you can't just measure outcomes because then you don't have a feeling about what's driving those outcomes. Social capital is one of the most important drivers of well-being and should be measured along with GDP, unemployment, etc., etc.
Okay. Well, we need to bring it to a close. I do think we have made progress in addressing the question is what do we mean by making progress? It has been a lively discussion, one that, as was pointed out, we get to continue on in the next hour. And so I'll look to Andy. Do we have any announcements and guidance for where we move next?
Can I just say, if anybody wants a copy of our reports, they're very welcome.
So we're heading over into the Koch building for our last two sessions. And then immediately after that, we're heading over to For the Forest for the reception this evening. We'll have directions for you on hand for those of you who'd like to make the walk over. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Thank you all very much.
And thank you for a wonderful panel.